Good evening, everyone, and welcome to yet another Young Voices debate. My name is Hikmat Matthew Abu Khater, and I'm the director and moderator of Young Voices debates. We host a monthly Oxford-style debate, either virtual or in person in New York City, focusing on the most pressing topics of our current political moment. Outside of Young Voices debates, I'm a graduate student at the Yale Jackson School of Global Affairs. Tonight's debate asks a question at the center of global economic policymaking. Is decarbonization an economically worthwhile endeavor? To have this debate, we have two excellent speakers that we could have not chosen better suitors for this two-sided debate for. So for this head-to-head, arguing in favor of the resolution for the proposition is Ethan Brown. Ethan, welcome to the stage.
Thank you for having me.
And for the opposition, we have David McGarry. David, welcome to the stage. All right. And let me just add that both debaters for this one are Young Voices alum. So that really makes us happy here at Young Voices. So let me introduce the proposition. Ethan Brown is the training program coordinator at the University of Rhode Island's Metcalf Institute, where he works at the intersection of journalism and climate communication. He is the founder and the host of The Sweaty Penguin, a comedy climate podcast presented by PBS's Peril and Promise initiative. In 2024, Ethan was named Covering Climate Now's Emerging Journalist of the Year. Ethan is a Young Voices alum, and he will be arguing that decarbonization is economically worthwhile. Welcome again, Ethan. For the opposition, we have David McGarry. David is the research director at Taxpayers Protection Alliance, where he focuses on economics and legal issues. He's another former Young Voices fellow and alum. His work has appeared in The Hill, Reason, Law and Liberty, and National Review. He is also a FreeCon signatory. David will be taking the negative. Welcome to you both. Tonight's debate will follow the Oxford-style format. We will have opening statements from each of the two debaters, 10 minutes each. Then we'll hear 5-minute rebuttals in the same order. Then we will go into the moderated Q&A, where I will moderate 30 to 40 minutes of questions from myself as the moderator, diving deeper into some of the topics that we were introduced during the debate, and also invite the two debaters to ask each other questions, and of course, open it for the audience online to ask whatever questions they have. And then we will conclude our debate with 5 minutes of closing statements following the same order. So as you're hearing the arguments, please, both debaters and people watching online, think about questions that you think would be worthwhile to engage with during our debate. All right, with that, let us begin. Ethan, you have the floor for your 10-minute opening statement. Take it away.
Well, good evening, and thank you to Young Voices for hosting this debate, and to my friend David for this important conversation. I've actually never participated in a debate before, so I'm very excited to finally vanquish my lifelong fear of confrontation. So we start by defining the resolution. Decarbonization is the sustained economy-wide process of reducing net greenhouse gas emissions over time, particularly in electricity, transportation, buildings, industry, and agriculture. Greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and others, and they're unique in that they trap heat. They absorb solar radiation after it bounces off the Earth's surface, which creates an overall warming effect. Most human emissions come from the three fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, but they also come from land use change, steel and cement, and a range of agricultural practices. Economically worthwhile means the benefits exceed the costs over time as compared to business as usual, including direct costs and hidden costs. And this is an endeavor, not one law or technology, but a project that includes a variety of innovations and policies. Now, decarbonization is not some brand new project we haven't started yet. In the United States, carbon dioxide emissions have fallen roughly 20% since 2005. Carbon-free electricity is now roughly 40% of the grid, and March 2025 marked the first time it surpassed 50% for an entire month. And globally, China's emissions are now declining, Europe is reducing faster than we are, and the world is plausibly at or near its emissions peak, meaning we should expect emissions reductions just around the corner.
Sorry, Ethan. Excuse me. I would like to interrupt you for 1 second. David might be having some audio issues, and he's not able to hear you. So let's
Oh,
just make sure we have that settled. I'll stop your time. David, how is the audio situation with your computer now?
Well, I can hear you loud and clear, but unfortunately, I'm not hearing anything at all from Ethan.
Okay. Let's see how we can try and fix that. Try and speak now, Ethan.
sure. Testing. Can you hear me?
David, try and leave the StreamYard and rejoin. Yeah, it seems to be an issue on David's side because I'm getting a note from the audience that you're audible, Ethan.
Okay, that's good.
Let's see.
Typically, I'm the
Maybe
one with
it's
the technology problems, so.
yeah, maybe it's big oil intervening in this debate, making giving your opponent an excuse.
Exactly.
Let's see. All right. Waiting on David to rejoin. But I think we should get this settled soon. Okay. All right, here's David. Let's try again. All right, David. Thumbs up if you can hear me.
You're still loud and clear.
Ethan, let's
Okay,
see.
testing. Can you hear me?
There we are.
Good.
Oh, great. Okay, we said it was Chevron or BP intervening on your behest, David, to give you an excuse with this debate. Okay, so Ethan, you have the choice whether you'd like to start over or you'd like to take. Actually, yes, let's start over so David can hear all of your arguments. So
Sure.
take it away, Ethan. You have 10 minutes.
Sure. So I'll go back to defining the resolution. So decarbonization is the sustained economy-wide process of reducing net greenhouse gas emissions over time, particularly in electricity, transportation, buildings, industry, and agriculture. Greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and others, and they're unique in that they trap heat. So they absorb solar radiation after it bounces off the Earth's surface, which creates an overall warming effect. So most human emissions come from the three fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, but they also come from land use change, steel and cement, and a range of agricultural practices. Economically worthwhile means the benefits exceed the costs over time compared to business as usual. That includes direct costs and hidden costs. And this is an endeavor, not one law or technology, but a project that includes a variety of innovations and policies. So, decarbonization, like I said, is not some brand new project that we haven't started yet. In the United States, carbon dioxide emissions have fallen roughly 20% since 2005. Carbon free electricity is now roughly 40% of the grid, and March 2025 marked the first time it surpassed 50% for an entire month. And globally, China's emissions are now declining, Europe is reducing faster than we are, and the world is plausibly at or near its emissions peak, meaning worldwide reductions are just around the corner. So the question tonight isn't whether we should begin some radical new endeavor. The question is whether we should support this decarbonization trajectory and make freer and fairer markets to speed it up, or whether we should ignore what the market has produced and interfere. I'll make three arguments. First, decarbonization is increasingly lower cost than business as usual. Second, it reduces hidden costs from environmental and public health harms. Third, it strengthens economic security and the reliability of critical systems. So let's start with electricity. Over the past decade, solar costs have fallen about 90%, onshore wind about 70%, and batteries by more than 90%. These technologies benefit from learning curves. As global capacity grows, we get better at making them, and costs fall. It's the same way computers and flat screen TVs went from comically expensive to affordable for everyday Americans. And as a result, we're now in a world where the levelized cost of onshore wind is roughly $49 per megawatt hour, solar around 60, while natural gas is around 74 and coal is around 115, and that's excluding subsidies. Economics is firmly on clean energy's side. The only thing slowing the transition is government policies that rig the game with fossil fuel tax breaks, slanted permitting processes, and other preferential treatment. We see similar gains in other sectors. In buildings, a majority of Americans would save on energy bills by using a heat pump instead of a standard furnace or boiler. In agriculture, manure repurposing and regenerative practices can also produce cost savings. Back in my podcast days, I actually interviewed a scientist, Ermias Kibrab, who found feeding cattle small amounts of red seaweed actually reduced methane emissions from their burps and at the same time improved feed conversion, meaning farmers needed to purchase less feed for each cow. Talk about a win win. And in transportation, public transit saves riders thousands of dollars over driving each year, and globally, gas powered vehicle sales peaked nearly a decade ago, while hybrids and EVs are on the rise. EVs are currently a little more expensive up front, but make it up in cheaper operating costs and less maintenance. And then there's the Jones Act, a World War I era law saying any ship traveling between two American ports must have been built in the US. This massive restriction makes maritime shipping so ridiculously expensive that only 2% of US freight is transported via ships, with way more expensive and polluting trucks and planes handling the rest. Reforming that law could unleash a whole new market for lower emission shipping at significantly reduced costs. Decarbonization also reduces massive hidden costs that don't show up on our bills. Let's start with coal. Rocky Mountain Institute found that from 2015 to 2023, American coal plants operating uneconomically, meaning running at a financial loss, produced pollution associated with tens of thousands of emergency room visits and premature deaths, millions of asthma related impacts, over 900,000 lost workdays, and over 3 billion lost school days. These hidden costs total $236 billion over that period. Again, just from the coal that was dispatched at a financial loss. Natural gas is a similar story. Fracking leads to the release of methane and particulates in the flaring process, not to mention intense noise, water, and light pollution, all of which have adverse health impacts that show up as societal costs. With transportation, in addition to air and noise pollution from vehicles, INRIX finds the average American loses about 99 hours per year to traffic, or $1,377 per person per year. When cars are stopped, they're still emitting, and it costs us time and money. In our homes, the annual societal cost of nitrogen oxide exposure from gas and propane stoves is estimated at $1 billion, according to a recent Science Advances study, with 50,000 asthma cases linked to cooking with gas. For our food, U.S. agricultural ammonia emissions, mainly from livestock manure, are estimated to incur societal costs of roughly $160 billion each year. And for steel, NYU researchers were able to link the 2016 closure of Shenango Coke Works, a coal-powered manufacturing facility outside Pittsburgh, to, quote, near instant decreases in local heart-related emergency department visits and hospitalizations for cardiovascular diseases. Again, near instant decreases. Lastly, let's talk about security and reliability. There's a town just north of Fort Myers, Florida, called Babcock Ranch, which is powered almost entirely by a giant solar farm, some rooftop solar, and 10 large battery storage units. During Hurricane Ian a few years ago, essentially every town in southwest Florida lost power, except Babcock Ranch. Why? Because sources like wind, solar, and battery storage are decentralized, they reduce the chance of a single power plant knocking out a whole region, and they don't depend on fuel deliveries. If a storm disrupts transportation, a natural gas or coal plant can't run without fuel. A solar panel doesn't need a tanker truck. In transportation, the Jones Act bites us here again, too. After Hurricane Fiona hit Puerto Rico a few years ago, there was a ship that happened to be moving diesel from Texas to Amsterdam that got rerouted to Puerto Rico to help. But since it wasn't a Jones Act compliant ship, it wasn't allowed to offload. Eventually, DHS issued a waiver allowing it to unload, and then a few months later, Congress passed a law stripping the right for DHS to issue a waiver like that, so it would not have been allowed to unload in the future. It's absurd to make it so impossible to conduct maritime shipping when it dramatically lowers costs, lowers carbon, and in this case, would have saved lives. There's other examples. Heat pumps can have longer lifespans and less maintenance than boilers. Regenerative agriculture practices strengthen soil and help crops withstand drought and floods. Crop rotations reduce vulnerability to pests and disease. And lastly, there is research showing that petrostates are more prone to conflict. Look around the world: Russia, Iran, Azerbaijan, Venezuela. These fossil fuel funded regimes do create an economic problem. Europe faced an energy crisis without Russian natural gas. In the US, we're not buying Iranian oil, but recent developments in the Strait of Hormuz have spiked global gas prices enough that I'm noticing it at the pump. You might have too. On the flip side, renewable energy is far more consistent. You don't need to import the sun or the wind, it's a one time setup. The 2024 Global Clean Tech Innovation Index had the United States at the top, followed by our allies in Canada, UK, Germany, France, Australia, and Israel. Decarbonizing the world with the innovations of America and our allies ensures it is us charting the future, not undemocratic adversaries. To recap, decarbonization saves money on direct costs, reduces significant hidden environmental and public health costs, and improves reliability and security across several critical systems. So thank you again, and David, I look forward to hearing your perspective.
Thank you very much, Ethan, for your opening statement. David, take it away. You have 10 minutes for your opening statement.
Well, thank you very much to Heckmont and to Young Voices for having me here. Thank you for Ethan for agreeing to stand across from me, as it were, in this debate. It's certainly a pleasure to be here, and it's even more of a pleasure now that I can hear what's going on. I'd like to start by saying a few things that I don't mean before I get into the meat and potatoes of my argument. I don't have any particular objection to clean energy policies, or excuse me, clean energy technologies per se, so long as they are competing in a free and open market against competing technologies. I personally would not be surprised if the free market were allowed to run its course and we did in fact come to some sort of quote unquote decarbonized economy at some point in the future, perhaps within the time span of several decades. But I would like to examine more closely the resolution before us, which is stated as such: decarbonization is an economically worthwhile endeavor. This resolution requires something of a dissection. The first word, decarbonization, only has meaningful content if it means that, to some extent, decarbonization is pursued as a project for its own sake. That is, for reasons other than the traditional market incentives to maximize profits by providing consumers, whether they be businesses or individuals, with maximally valuable goods and services within the confines of responsible risk management. And I emphasize this point because if decarbonization were economically worthwhile by traditional metrics, nobody would need to force firms that are subject to the direction of the invisible hand to pursue this path. Unfortunately, that is not the world in which we live. In fact, if decarbonization meant nothing besides following the economic incentives wherever they might lead, I don't believe that we would be having this debate tonight. To borrow from Milton Friedman's argument against quote unquote sustainable corporate responsibility, the project of decarbonization loses all of its meaning if it is defined merely as profit-seeking firms furthering their pecuniary interests. Economically worthwhile, the next phrase in the resolution, may be taken to mean the returns made by businesses and investors, but it means much more than that. The end of all production is consumption, as Adam Smith wrote. And in turn, the end of consumption, though by no means its totality, is the good life, is obtaining the things that we need to live out our days in happiness and prosperity. The question of economic benefits must be viewed in terms of human flourishing in its fullest extent. And we must take the point of view of the final line of consumption. How are people actually living in their day-to-day lives? We're not talking only about the profitability of energy companies and institutional investors. But when analyzing the various policies that decarbonization has pushed, we have to remember the lives that are saved, for example, by reliable sources of energy that power heating in the frigid winters and air conditioning during the sweltering summers. The United Nations has estimated that heat deaths in the on the European continent amount to right about, let's see, right about 235 million annually. That is across Europe. The figure in the United States is 4. Much of this differential can be attributed to the European Union's stifling regulation. Another consideration is the cheap and abundant goods and services that we take advantage and often take for granted every day, which themselves depend upon cheap, reliable, and abundant energy, the lifeblood of our economy. In fact, a good portion of the economic stagnation experienced by the United Kingdom and the European Union flows directly from their environmental regulations. Families' paychecks and businesses' account, which, if left unmolested by the high prices imposed by green energy mandates, allow them to purchase other goods and services. The real measures of prosperity, any dollar that is spent on artificially high energy costs is a dollar that cannot be put to other purposes. On the investing front, although stock ownership is concentrated in the higher income brackets, about 3/5 of Americans own stock, and about 80% of 401k assets of Americans under 65 can be found invested in equities. Loss of profits due to ideologically driven investing will detract from the quality of life that Americans are able to enjoy once they reach retirement. Next, I move on to the word worthwhile in the resolution. The critical fact that we all must recognize during this debate is that the question of decarbonization is one of opportunity costs. Even granting that humanity should strive to be carbon neutral, the activity of decarbonization means many discrete choices made by specific actors at this point in time. It also means funds invested here and not there, certain technologies being brought to market and others left by the wayside, and certain regulations being imposed upon industries and individuals with measurable, or in some cases semi-measurable, negative effects experienced by the regulated. Now, on the other side of the opportunity cost calculus, or I should say the cost benefit calculus, we have seen time and time again that reports predicting the disastrous consequences of man-made climate change have proven to be false. We've all heard the pattern. Such and such would be predicted to have happened by 1980. Then 1980 arrives and the doomsday clock is reset for 2000, and then 2020, etc. I would like to highlight a study published in Nature in April of 2024, which I think is illustrative. Over the course of about a year and a half, it underwent constant challenges until finally the authors were forced, or I should say the publisher, Nature, was forced to retract it. Now, one of the achievements of the Great Enrichment was the rise of prosperity. To a certain extent, it was the triumph of man over the constraints of nature, the greatest killer of all. Now, we surely must not destroy our adversary in this fight, and we must actually protect it, even as we work to change the ways we interact with it. But when considering decarbonization, we must first consider the benefits and the costs as well. Now, finally, we arrive at the word endeavor, which implies that decarbonization is an end that we ought to pursue, as I said before, for its own sake. I make this point to reemphasize that I do not object to clean energy technologies per se. I object to their subsidization and the regulatory strangulation of other technologies. If zero carbon energy sources, vehicles, and appliances would triumph in the hurly-burly of free markets, let it be so. However, the record in especially the United States and Europe has demonstrated that these technologies will not be adopted absent government intervention. And the second point I would make about the final word in this resolution is in endeavor to be taken on by whom. We must remember where we are, who we are, in the constraints of our time and place. For the purposes of this debate, I think I'm safe to say that we are Americans, and our lawmakers and regulators can only control so much. As American emissions have dropped in recent decades, they've become a smaller slice of the overall pie. In fact, in 2024, America produced just 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. China, by contrast, was responsible for nearly 3 times more. Add thereto the emissions of the Indians, the Russians, and all the rest. To take one discrete example from the American Enterprise Institute's Benjamin Zeiker, he wrote that the elimination of all greenhouse gas emissions from all United States natural gas and petroleum systems by 2050 would reduce global temperatures in 2100 by 0.0076 degrees Celsius, which, and he continues, because of the standard deviation of the surface temperature record is 0.11 degrees Celsius, would not be detectable. This all might be boiled down to what my interlocutor has identified in his writing as the Taylor Swift problem at the national scale. We are threatening, if we pursue these policies and to pursue an aggressive course of decarbonization, to sacrifice the very things that make our lives good and prosperous in the 21st century for negligible benefits. And with that, I have come to the end of my time, and I very much look forward to questions and challenges and continuing the conversation.
Right on time. Excellent. Thank you both for your opening statements. Ethan, let's jump right into the rebuttals. You have 5 minutes.
Sure, thank you, David, and I will do my best to hit some of those things. I won't have time for all of them, but first I need to flag a little catch-22 you set up for me, because your decarbonization definition requires that decarbonization be uneconomical for it to be called decarbonization. If that were the definition, then I simply can't defend my point of view. So I'm going to push back on that a little bit. I think that decarbonization can be economical and still be decarbonization. In fact, that's what I think it is. For the point about the European Union and heat deaths, I agree that the EU should put in air conditioning, and that can be heat pumps, that can be green. But the reason that EU energy prices have spiked is not due to green policy. It's due to taxes that are not required to be green policy. It's due to them decommissioning nuclear energy, which is perfectly great carbon-free energy that serves as a great backup source, and because of the Russian invasion in Ukraine that caused them to stop getting Russian gas. Spain, which is one of the European countries that's had the lowest fossil fuel percentage, around 20% of their grid is fossil fuels, have actually seen the most stable and cheap prices, not the most, but one of the more stable and cheap prices in Europe, as opposed to countries like Germany and the UK, where fossil fuel percentage of the grid is more like 40% and 30% respectively. And lastly, let's come back to the free market. Fossil fuels have a laundry list of tax deductions and preferential policies that rig markets in their favor. The expensing of intangible drilling costs, excess of percentage over cost depletion, and deductions on not just foreign income taxes, but foreign royalties, are a few of the big tax breaks offered to fossil fuels and not to clean energy. The latter deduction is why Exxon recorded no U.S. income taxes in 2009, and fossil fuel deductions have been reliably and predictably renewed throughout history, as opposed to the investment tax credit and production tax credit for clean energy, which have expired, changed, been renewed, and most recently been repealed in the One Big Beautiful Bill. But tax deductions are far from the whole story. On federal land, oil and gas lease auctions are actually required every quarter. And if a parcel doesn't sell, something called non-competitive leasing kicks in, where the government then offers the land to the first bidder at a ridiculous discount. From 2001 to 2020, 28% of leased federal land was issued non-competitively at an average 99.5% discount. Meanwhile, wind and solar don't get non-competitive leasing, and in fact, as the law is written now, the federal government is forbidden from leasing land to wind and solar unless they've had an oil or gas lease auction in the last 120 days and issued a minimum number of acres to oil and gas the previous year. And once they do manage to get land, solar and wind developers have to pay 20 times what fossil fuel companies pay to the government in royalties. In addition, fossil fuels benefit from a far more consistent permitting process. It takes an average 18 months to permit a gas pipeline, but over 4 years to permit clean energy transmission lines, and often more. And a slow and cumbersome permitting process favors incumbents over anything new, regardless of economics. The government also often pays the cost of major spills and site remediations, and fossil fuels also get the US military's help protecting their overseas assets, with that bill coming to the taxpayer. The fracking industry might never have happened if not for 2008 big bank bailout money. And by the way, the Jones Act has almost single handedly prevented American offshore wind from getting off the ground because there are no Jones Act compliant ships that can install turbines, and it's ridiculously expensive to build one. So I'm all for free markets here. Decarbonization does not need subsidies or mandates. Texas is the least regulated state for energy and has nearly double the wind, solar, and battery capacity of California, and the rest of the country isn't even close. And by the way, their electric prices fell 5% from 2019 to 2024. So, given a free and fair market, clean energy does win on its own merits. And the fact that it also helps the environment, health, and so many other issues is just a cherry on top.
Thank you, Ethan. David, 5 minutes for your rebuttal. Please take it away.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think we can find some common ground and spend the remainder of this debate heaping scorn on the Jones Act, which is really one of the worst regulations that this country has ever come up with, and one that proves that there's nothing so temporary as 100-year-old government program. I would like to discuss a few things. First of all, I think a crucial question is, what is the time frame? As technologies become more efficient, I don't see why there would not be a move in the future towards technologies that have that give off less carbon dioxide and other such emissions. Um, but again, I think the question is whether we are to interfere in this process and to speed it up. Um, on that front, I think it is important to discuss the various benefits and the various roadblocks that are put in front of the respective technologies. I would never argue that fossil fuels compete in a totally free and fair market, and just as I think that it's implausible to say that renewables compete in a totally free and fair market. Um, Both have a great degree of leniency and subsidization, but both also are hamstrung to a great degree as well. And if we are to take this seriously, we have to look at the effectiveness of the technologies. And as I will probably make the case during the question and answer period, um, I don't believe that if all regulations and encouragements were eliminated tomorrow, that clean energy would sweep across the country, and that it would replace the old way of doing things. Now, one thing to continue in my rebuttal, um, I would like to pick up on something that Ethan said. Um, he said that we are engaged, or the question we face is whether we continue an ongoing process, which he described as not radical. I don't think that because something is ongoing means that it's not radical. And I think if you examine the public statements of many regulators on the left, both in the United States and in Europe, you will find that they have some very radical ideas about what the shape of the economy should look like, both in energy and in other places. Um, another thing that we have to address when we're talking about costs of respective technologies is not just cost, it's reliability. In fact, Spain, which Ethan cited as an example of stable prices, experienced a pretty severe blackout in 2024, largely because it had transitioned to clean energy. On the issue of petrostates and their likelihood to enter wars and conflicts, I don't necessarily think that it's the oil that pushes these states towards being particularly aggressive. And I don't necessarily think that Ethan would say that either. Obviously, there are certain things within the structure of these countries' regimes, um, and in their political cultures, at least the political culture of the ruling class in each one of these places, that make them more likely to be aggressors, and to either conduct or fund all sorts of bad operations. However, that doesn't mean that the US should try to pivot from oil or pivot from fossil fuels. That means that we should unlock the bountiful natural reserves of these things that we have by taking down the regulatory barriers that are stopping them from being pulled out of the ground or from being extracted, um, being extracted from our territory. And that doesn't mean that renewables shouldn't also be allowed to compete in that race. But it means that we should focus on energy abundance, and we should, once again, everyone can take a drink. We should repeal the Jones Act, which will allow for far more portability of fuel, and we should become reliable not by looking to change our model of our economy and our model of producing energy, but by unlocking the natural resources that we have. On the point of state prices, if you would look at the relative prices for energy in various states, you'll
David, I'm
find.
afraid you're at time, but hold on to this thought. Mention it during the Q&A session if you can, or keep it to your closing statements. All right, so I'll start us off with a couple of questions here for our Q&A session. Ethan, no one in this debate, actually this is for both of you, so I'll start with you, Ethan, first. No one in this debate mentioned the question of labor and how it affects the economic viability of decarbonization. So the example you gave us, Ethan, about this coal factory in Pittsburgh, shutting down, and how amazing it was for the environment, and how the effect was immediate. How are we not taking into consideration the hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the Pittsburghs around the nation who are losing their jobs and having to end up on welfare to sustain themselves, especially considering the current moment we're in, where I'm sure we all three remember when some coal mines shuttered down, and then pundits in Washington said, "Oh, learn to code," as if that will be an alternative viable solution. Now, in the age of AI, Claude is taking that job too, and our AI agents are coding on our behalf. So we are entering a very unstable period for labor. Why would we add to the uncertainty by going full into the decarbonization by limiting these jobs that are somewhat reliable in our labor market?
I appreciate that question a lot, and I'm a big Pittsburgh Steelers fan, so I certainly want to see steelworkers have jobs, coal miners have jobs, all of that. And I think the opportunity here is to see a growing economy from cheaper and more abundant energy. Currently, it would be cheaper to actually shut down 99% of US coal plants and build a new solar or wind farm next door than to continue operating the plant, according to Energy Innovation. There is a huge economic opportunity here, and the only reason it isn't happening is that the president has actually issued executive orders, emergency executive orders, ordering these coal plants to stay open. I believe that coal miners, any people who are going to be out of work from this transition, should be getting training programs, and maybe not into coding. I found that a little weird too, but into things like renewable energy installation, construction in general. This is a little off topic, but we need more houses in America badly, and that would be a very productive thing for more people to get involved with. So I don't know exactly what that training looks like, but I do want to see them supported. And I believe that if we do, we will get a net greater number of jobs, and hopefully those people can get some of those jobs. And that can also help with any offsets with AI if we have a new, not new, but a continually growing industry in clean energy.
Thanks, Ethan. David, same question.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm going to help my case very much here. But as a good free marketeer and a committed Trumpetarian, I recognize that, well, whatever the very real pain might be felt by people who lose their jobs, due either to some kind of energy transition or to other changes in the economy, um, the there will be dislocation. But the question is not how do we prevent dislocation, because that's a method or a recipe for stagnation, which brings its own problems. The question is, how do we create an economy in which these people can find new jobs? And one thing we've seen in areas with large amounts of job turnover from various modern dynamics in the economy is that the narrative that people simply lose their jobs and then are unable to find more work is simply false. There are towns that have rebuilt around new industries and in fact flourish even more than they were before the initial dislocation occurred. However, there are specific places where cultural facts, the decay of civil society, or regulations, including occupational licensing laws and laws that preference unions, prevent people from exercising or from making the most of their talents, rather, and finding these new opportunities for themselves. Um, and in fact, one of the problems when you said people might go on welfare, this triggered something in my brain. One of the problems that we have in this country with men not working, um, as AEI's Nick Eberstadt has chronicled, and Scott Winship as well from AEI. When we offer a copious amount of benefits and welfare, people are more likely to take the government up on that offer. Unfortunately, as much as we want to help people avoid pain, if you provide a total safety net in which the cost of losing your job is very low because you can simply go to the government for support, you are less incentivized to go get a new job. And something about human nature is that we need problems to solve. If somebody comes in and makes our lives perfect for us, we are apt to end up sad and unhealthy and very likely alone.
Thank you both for your responses to this first initial question. I'm going to jump into my question to you, David. But as I do so, I would ask you two to think of questions you want to poke at the arguments of your opponent with. And also our audience online. I see that there's a lively debate happening in the chat. Please send in questions. Send in questions to challenge both of the debaters, challenge even the premise of the arguments that they're making, and phrase them as a question as much as you can, but we will do our best to parse through those comments. We would love to have as much engagement as you can afford us. Okay, so David, my question to you is about your comment that you made about free markets and how you want to make sure that the competition for these energy resources is not tampered with. It's only the market deciding. Ethan kind of alluded to this, but we're dealing with almost a century of precedent where we know for a fact that our government, our country intervened on behalf of oil companies, whether that be supporting Texaco in Ecuador, whether that be supporting our allies with their in British Petroleum in our overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran. So because they nationalized nationalize their oil resources. So we see that even today in Venezuela. Trump is holding the hands of Chevron and Total and ExxonMobil executives and telling them, here's your market for your crude oil from Venezuela after we kidnapped the president. So in my worldview, there's a lot of subsidizing taking place for these oil corporations, these fossil fuel corporations. And if anyone who's listening or either of you know the story of Steven Donziger, the human rights lawyer who tried to sue Chevron and succeeded and got a payout of got for the people of Ecuador, whom Chevron had been polluting their rainforest, almost $10 billion, the US government essentially backed Chevron in their litigation, political litigation against this lawyer, and put him in house arrest for 5 years. So there's a lot of examples that I threw in here of our government subsidizing oil, subsidizing these fossil fuel firms. So what do you say to this argument that the stage has not been very balanced? It's not been a fair competition.
Well, first off, I'm going to dodge away from the field of foreign policy because I don't really think that necessarily is what the crux of our debate is about, which is how do we produce these resources or these technologies domestically, or alternatively, how do we get them peacefully from trading partners? Now, as I said, I am very skeptical that all of the claims that have been made about the efficacy and the cheapness of green energy will actually play out in practice. And I will sort of walk down the line of a few different points in the economic chain that brings these things to consumers. So first of all, I would say is that as I mentioned, the question about green energy isn't just about the cost of producing per unit. It's also about reliability. What happens if the sun don't shine and the wind don't blow? And those are not only seasonal questions, but especially in the case of solar power, that is a question that we confront every day at dusk. And the fact is that solar and wind require a certain amount of coordination and supplementation with more traditional energy fuels to make up for those deficits that are inherent to the technologies. I would, in the most extreme cases, I know I mentioned the blackouts in Spain earlier, but this is not an isolated event. Spain, Portugal, parts of France, of course, the famous 2021 struggles in the Texas winter, which proved fatal, all bear out the fact that these technologies are not reliable 24/7, 365, which is really the span of time in which human beings require energy. There are other problems. The amount of land that's required to deploy solar and wind technology, especially on land, has proven troublesome, because oftentimes that will require more transmission technology, which the United States lacks. To move more to the consumer side for my the second part of this three-part reply, take the electric vehicle. It turns out that consumers are not particularly fond of electric vehicles. Companies like Ford have been posting massive losses on their electric vehicle portfolio, and that is because they are more expensive, and oftentimes the federal government subsidies of the EVs have simply gone to upper class people who would have bought electric vehicles anyway. But also because electric vehicles tend to need more maintenance throughout their life. That is just an unfortunate fact, especially there's been reports in the winter months of electric vehicles becoming increasingly unreliable. And moreover, electric vehicles need a place to charge, which given the sparseness of charging stations at this moment, has also disincentivized a lot of consumers from purchasing EVs. And this is particularly important because I think one thing that you see the more you think about the larger project of decarbonization is that the extent of the thing is tremendous, because as soon as you solve one problem, you realize that it's connected to 5 other problems and deficiencies, 5 other reasons why the US economy isn't ready to embrace clean technology if such an end state could ever be reached. The final thing I'll say is on the investment front. We have seen over the course of years, actually decades, that funds that rely on or that prioritize ESG investing do not return profits at the same level as strictly traditional funds. In fact, as I was doing research for this debate, I was interested to see, and I think you'll be interested to hear, that we have studies on this going back to 2002, and the numbers may have shifted as different economists do their analyses, but the conclusion is clear. These sorts of projects are simply less profitable because the businesses in which the money is invested do not return the same kinds of profits.
Thank you, David. Ethan, same question and also a lot of extra points made by David. Please take it away, your answer.
Yeah, you gave me a lot to respond to. I'll try to keep track. So first I'll try to address your question, Hekmet, a little bit. I think that David mentioned earlier that fossil fuels are not necessarily the cause of why these petrostates like Russia and Iran are committing violence and aggression against other countries. I would agree that it's not the cause, but I would ask what funds it and what allows these undemocratic regimes to have money and not rely on a tax base that they have to hold accountable. That's fossil fuel money that goes right into the hands of these dictators who pursue this aggression. Whether it's for other reasons or not, it is funded by fossil fuels. For the point about reliability, yes, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. And that's why you create a grid that includes not just solar and wind, but also battery storage. A nuclear plant will always turn uranium into barium, krypton, and carbon-free energy. You can have hydro, you can have geothermal. You can have a grid that is set up to withstand periods when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. On the flip side, the reliability points that I mentioned in my opening, how do you handle a storm that knocks a natural gas plant or a coal plant off the grid? David mentioned Winter Storm Uri in Texas in 2021. The cause of those blackouts was not due to solar and wind. It was due to natural gas plants getting knocked off the grid, being frozen. And since then, they've done winterization efforts, they've done grid upgrades, and they've added a lot more solar and wind and batteries. And as a result, Winter Storm Fern last month saw, I believe, no blackouts, if not very few blackouts in Texas. A very good success story that shows the promise of clean energy. To EVs, I would like to push on some of your concerns because EVs don't require less maintenance. You're right about the winter issue, but EVs don't have brake pads, they don't have oil changes. You do not have to take EVs into the car manufacturer nearly as much. Additionally, after you buy it, it's cheaper to operate, it produces less noise, it has way better range. You don't have to worry about gas prices, which are volatile based on global markets. And it averts not just carbon emissions, but tailpipe emissions of particulate matter and nitrogen oxide, and all the harmful impacts of oil drilling in refineries. So I don't think EVs are perfect. I think the winter issue is a good one that you mentioned, but there are people working on solutions to create self-heating batteries, to create electrolytes that you can add to batteries that address this issue. I think there is a path forward here. And the fact that gasoline-powered vehicle sales have been declining in the last decade globally, whereas hybrids and EVs are on the rise, is an important point. Lastly, to ESG really quick. I don't disagree that ESG funds don't always perform as well as traditional funds. I'll disclose I'm invested in the S&P 500, not in any ESG funds. But I do think that that's not necessarily a marker of whether decarbonization is economically viable, because ESG funds do invest in fossil fuel companies, and they do it intentionally. They work with the fossil fuel companies that are taking the most action on decarbonization as an incentive for them to continue doing so. But that's a very different structure than what we're talking about here. So I think I answered all those points.
Okay, thank you both. Let's start with some of the questions that we're getting online. As we do so, again, I remind the audience, please, we see a couple of the questions you sent. Send as many as you'd like. Send them all the questions. And Ethan and David, think of the question that you'd like to pose to your opponent. Question to you, David. David says that he believes if we let energy companies compete, then he wouldn't be surprised if we get to carbon neutral eventually. Why isn't that happening now, but for but for subsidies and government intervention, what would change in his free market world that leads to that eventuality?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is that it's a matter of time frame. Time matters very much. We have to take account of the technologies we have today. As I've said, as I've said, I don't think that green technologies are ready for prime time. I would quibble some of Ethan's comments about Texas and the causes of that blackout, and also with the relative reliability of green energy and traditional energy sources. I think he has some. I think he has some of his analysis that's a little bit off there. Um, but as we've seen, even if you sort of look at the move from coal to natural gas is obviously a more preferable source, um, if you're looking at it from an environmentalist perspective. I see no reason to think that this trend won't continue, but again, the time frame to which I refer is more along the lines of several decades, if not a century. If you try to force green technologies that are not able to compete on free markets or compete in free markets, you are going to incur a host of economic harms and economic damage, um, as we have seen in Europe and the UK. Um, as I said, these the question is not whether I think the the end, sort of the perfect science fiction world that we might experience at some late date will be carbonized or decarbonized, some mix of cleaner technologies and some mix of fossil fuels, but whether we are willing to take on a substantial reduction in our prosperity and in our quality of life in order to rush that process. As I said, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what do we do now with the facts on the ground as we find them?
Quick comment on the same question, Ethan, and then we'll jump into some more questions from the audience.
Sure. Can you repeat the question for me?
Yes, the question is as follows. David said that he believes if we let energy companies compete, then he wouldn't be surprised if we get to carbon neutral eventually. Why isn't that happening now, but for the subsidies and government interventions?
I mean, I think the reason it's not happening faster is a lot of the government interventions in favor of fossil fuels that I mentioned earlier. I'm not saying
Okay.
that clean energy hasn't had some credits, the investment tax credit and the production tax credit, but those have been around since 1978 and 1992, respectively. And they're tax credits, not subsidies, which means they only really kick in when these projects are being invested in, and that's why we've seen the subsidies for solar and wind go up in the past decade because people are taking on these projects. But that's in the face of all of the barriers that I mentioned earlier: permitting laws, preferential treatment for land leases, etc. Um, David mentioned the transition from coal to natural gas. That transition was made possible in part due to the invention of fracking, but fortunately for them, that invention came around the same time as the 2008 financial crisis. After that, a bunch of investment banks got these big government bailouts, and fracking companies came in and talked them into investing in fracking. And that's great, except the problem is when you do, I can't believe I'm going to say something nice about oil drilling, but when you drill at an oil site, you can set up your infrastructure. You are there for years and years, and that infrastructure can stay put. That reduces the fixed cost as compared to the amount that you get out. With fracking, you set up your equipment, and it takes maybe a year to frack a single site. That's great in that you can get energy out more efficiently, but it's not because it raises the fixed cost across the entire system. You have to keep moving to new sites, transporting all this equipment, setting everything up, and that takes a lot of work. Fortunately, there's that drilling credit that oil companies get that means they can write off every single expense related to that setup. But had they not gotten that bailout money, it would have been completely economically untenable. It cost a lot of money to go to these sites, and that's why we saw in 2020 one of the inventors of fracking, Chesapeake Energy, went bankrupt, and we saw wild changes to our energy markets the second that the economy made a downturn. So I would say that if we move ourselves out, let free markets do what they're going to do, um, I do think there's an argument to be made that we should be pricing in hidden costs. But even if we didn't do that, I do think clean energy would grow and take over because clean energy has learning curves where they get more efficient and more economical over time, whereas fossil fuels do not because you have to keep the actual energy, and that's always going to be a cost.
Okay, let's jump into another audience question here, and we'll go through these a little bit quicker so that we can get to your questions to each other. So for Ethan, what do you think a realistic timeline for decarbonization looks like? Do you think that this timeline will ease some of the potential woes of the transition?
Sure, and I think that's an important question because I do not think we should ban carbon tomorrow or anything. I do not support banning fracking. I wouldn't support any super restrictive regulations that try to clamp this down faster than is economically realistic. It's important to have energy reliability, as David and I have both talked about. I do think that the scientific projections that say that we should be reducing greenhouse gas emissions to try to be steeper cuts in the next 5 to 10 years and get to carbon neutral by mid-century is a realistic projection. I don't think that that needs to be enforced through super draconian mandates or anything, but I do think that it is possible given a lot of the research that has been done. Furthermore, I think there's opportunity to go carbon negative after we go carbon neutral. There are solutions from marine carbon dioxide removal to planting forests to more technical things like direct air capture and scrubbers on uh, emitting plants that can bring us into carbon negative territory, which means that even though we may actually cross the 1.5 degrees Celsius marker in the Paris Agreement in possibly the next few years, we can bend it back down and actually succeed on that agreement by the end of the century. And I think that's very plausible. Um,
David,
yeah.
would you like to make a quick comment, or should I jump into the next one?
We can continue.
Question, I think, to you, David. Consumers love EVs. They are reluctant because our government doesn't build out the grid. EV sales as a percentage in the market in the US, it's under 10%, Germany 25%, China over 50%, Norway 90%. And then I think the questioner references one of your comments. Forgive me, I don't remember exactly how it factors into the question, but they say a little bit off in what respect? So David, take it away. What is your response to this grid discrepancy, seemingly a grid discrepancy in the U.S. market?
Sure. Well, what I would say is it's certainly not true that everyone doesn't want to drive an electric vehicle. That's obviously false. Um, but it still seems to be a minority, particularly of upper income Americans, that are attracted towards that kind of vehicle. Um, I would not say. Well, actually, I would refer to something in the question itself, which stated that EVs would EVs would be economically viable on the market if the government intervened and spent a lot of money and tried to build things, which, by the way, they did under Joe Biden's administration. And that project turned out to be a debacle that had an incredibly difficult time building even a single electric vehicle charging station. Um, the demand for EVs soared when they were subsidized under Biden. That's true. And then there was overproduction in the United States, and companies, Ford, as I said before, is the big one, that's made the most headlines, have taken incredible losses. It's just completely staggering numbers. And just recently, Stellantis announced a complete overhaul of the way that they do business. Now, exactly how that will shape up, I don't think we know quite yet, but they're looking at making some serious changes. With respect to Europe and to China, making a case for free markets based on either of those systems doesn't really work. Um, the Europeans have far more stringent environmental regulations than we Americans do. And my gosh, in the in the Chinese economy, if you think that or the saturation of American markets with electric vehicles has been economically problematic for our companies, ask the Chinese how their project is going over there. The fact is, um, they push so hard to get cheap, reliable EVs in that country that the market was glutted with them far more than any consumers could buy. And they have a real problem where they have a race to the bottom in terms of cost cutting among manufacturers and oversupply. They have cars sitting in lots, and they've been doing quite a lot of work. And I should be specific, the Chinese government is doing quite a lot of work to figure out how to export these vehicles, which is in turn causing geopolitical problems, as Beijing tries to force this economically unneeded and unwanted product into foreign markets, which is displacing the domestic manufacturers in places like Germany. So there are all kinds of problems with electric vehicles, per se, and I say that referring specifically to the technologies as they exist today. Obviously, I think they do have a place in U.S. markets, but the fact is it's a small place. And time and time again in America and in other countries, we see that the real push for EVs has its source in government interventions and not in true unencouraged consumer demand.
Okay, Ethan, a quick comment on the same question?
Yeah, I think so. China decides the US is number one, they're number two, they want to work their way up. So what do? They invest in EV manufacturing, in solar manufacturing, in rare earth mineral mining. They take this path to try to assert themselves on the world stage. And what's happening? Europe is buying Chinese EVs. Canada is now buying Chinese EVs. Our allies are turning to them over us for their cars. Whereas in America, yes, we had a $7,500 tax credit for people who purchase an EV from 2023 to 2025. We also put a prohibitive tariff on Chinese EVs so that they would not be imported into our economy. Now, I'm not saying we should just move to Chinese EVs. I want to see American car manufacturers do this successfully. The technology was invented here, after all. But I think that in a free market, sure, we might see a lot of Chinese EVs come into the US economy. So people had a choice when they had this $7,500 tax credit. They could buy it, they didn't have to buy it. And if they did, they saw cheaper fuel, cheaper maintenance, and certainly I'm not saying EVs are perfect. I've written articles critiquing mandates like the one in California, but I do think they have a lot of benefits. And I think David's kind of focusing on the cost, but not looking at the full picture there.
Okay, so with that in mind,
Could I make a couple of comments about that?
Could you put it into your question to Ethan?
Oh, I will hold then, since I have
Okay,
a second question.
A quick comment and then go into your question for Ethan.
Just quickly, I think I want to set a couple things straight. The Biden administration had more than just the consumption credit for EVs. There were also credits on the production side, which were important and actually spurred on the planning of new manufacturing, which simultaneously crashed and burned. On the front of Chinese trade, I think it's a problem for certain countries, at least from a political perspective. But if if you oppose American tariffs on Chinese cars, and this isn't directed at Ethan, because he would have no way of knowing this. But if the audience is curious about my thoughts about that, you can look up the op-ed I wrote in Town Hall. So I agree that there are certain pressures from Chinese EVs, and that if we didn't have protectionism, there would be more Chinese cars on the market. But unless we discover some kind of security concern or technological concern, as a good free trader, I struggle to see exactly how that's a problem from a libertarian economics perspective.
You get to comment, Ethan, or we jump into the Q&A between you guys. Up to you. You can waive your right for either or neither.
Yeah, we can jump into the Q&A. That's good.
Okay,
Or,
David, would you like to start with your question for Ethan?
Sure. So you began to talk about this a little bit earlier, but I would like to drill down, if possible, and get a better sense of your limiting principle on some of these regulations, because the fact is, you hear people on my side talking a lot about, the anti-human left is trying to destroy our economy and return us all to the loving arms of Mother Gaia and that kind of thing. And you're obviously not coming from that camp. You're far too sensible and far too humane for that kind of thing. But I still think, to a certain extent, at least from a messaging perspective, you are exposed to a problem of being a moderate in what generally is a very radical camp. So, as I said, I'd like to get a little bit more of a sense for where you would start drawing your lines. And specifically, there was as I was preparing for this debate, I was reading through an op-ed you wrote in The Hill about the Biden EPA's vehicle emission standards and emission standards for power plants. And you readily admitted that those regulations had their flaws, and that they might impose restrictions which technology wasn't quite prepared to adhere to. But you also said something interesting about the you said something interesting about the regulation that was under consideration in West Virginia versus EPA. You seem to indicate that you thought that would on net be good for the environment. So I would be curious to hear, especially with specifics like that. Not trying to trap you,
no,
just trying to use discrete examples that many of us are familiar with, to get a better sense of how you would weigh the costs and benefits of regulatory proposals that are very much on the table.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I appreciate that. I think it's true. There are some radicals in the environmental movement, and I've had the pleasure of coming across many. I think part of why I really love the work that I do is I get to work with scientists all the time. I get to connect journalists with scientists and community members and really try to ground these conversations in scientific thought and not some of the more ideological perspectives. To your actual question, I think it's sometimes hard for me to answer because I feel like the market is so rigged right now. I feel that permitting laws, zoning laws, which I haven't even gotten to, zoning laws prevent us from building commercial residential mixes or having multifamily homes, which are more energy efficient. But if you have commercial residential mixes, people can walk and bike to work. There's less traffic. There's lots of benefits there. And then the Jones Act, as you and I very strongly agree upon. So I think my steps 1 through 3 is reform all of that, create a level playing field, look at those laws that are favoring fossil fuels over clean energy on land leases and all of that. Then from there, it's a tough hypothetical. I think in a dream world where I put on my economics 101 hat, I would love to see a lot of the hidden costs that I talked about in my opening statement somehow get priced into the market. It's really hard to do because scientific studies inherently have uncertainty, and uncertainty is not saying we don't know. Uncertainty is saying there's error bars, there's confidence intervals, the true cost could be somewhere between 6 billion and 13 billion, and how are you supposed to create a externality, set up a tax or a subsidy around that. But I do think that there is a way to kind of incorporate some of these hidden costs into the market. I'm open to that. I'm a little less into mandates. I think that there are cases like, for example, switching from incandescent to LED light bulbs, where I don't hate mandates as much because it's just $1 or $2 more expensive and saves you like 50-fold on energy prices or energy efficiency. But most of the time, I would think that I want to preserve people's freedom, let the market work out a lot of this, but create not just a free market, but a fair market where some of these health costs, environmental costs, and climate costs are factored in.
Thank you, Ethan. Ethan, we have just enough time for you to ask your question to David and David to get a quick response from you. And then we'll take some of the leftover questions. I'll pose them to you, ask you to take notes, and hopefully you'll address those last couple of questions in your closing remarks. So Ethan, your question to David, please.
Yeah, I had a couple, but I'll pick one. Going off what I was just saying, do you agree with me that a economically worthwhile analysis of decarbonization should include major hidden costs like health impacts and environmental degradation? And if so, how high would those externalities need to be to change your opinion on the resolution?
Sure. Well, as a as a dutiful, if sometime intermittent reader of some of all of our favorite economists, we obviously have to deal with the problem of externalities, and I know that. I think there could certainly be a case at the margins that, as you put it, building those costs into the process of operating in the market could theoretically be feasible. However, I would say that I think the bar for me would be pretty high. And I would also say that if we wanted to shift towards a system that looks something more like that, we would quite obviously have to repeal a bunch of the other taxes and regulations that businesses currently have to wade through. An analogy to this would be my preference for getting rid of the income tax. However, getting rid of the federal income tax would obviously require a complete overhaul of the system. I think, though, I wouldn't say that that changes my position on the resolution. I don't think that we can really equate guardrails placed on the markets to protect against externalities, which is a tried and true principle that, as far as I know, most, if not all, respectable free market economists endorse. I don't think we can call those things, or we can equate those things to the full scale process of decarbonization, which is what we are what we've been discussing here tonight. There's the famous device that professors sometimes use when they ask their children how much would you do to get rid of pollution, or get rid of litter, say. And at first, you start looking at the big problem. You say, okay, we have street sweepers, we have this, we have that, and then you get down to the question of how much would you do to remove, say, the last gum wrapper from a city street. And that, of course, would take an intensive process of searching for it, looking on the streets, looking under benches. You don't know how many people you have to devote to that, and suddenly the costs go skyrocketing, and they're not really worth it. They don't improve the quality of life. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, I do believe that the effects, or the amount of effects that climate change are supposed to have are often overstated in the traditional literature. And I think we've seen this time and time again with retracted studies, with studies that go out of date fairly quickly. I am very skeptical of new breaking sort of flashy pieces that come out, simply because with the requisite amount of time, very often it turns out that the calculations, the models, or the data that fed into those studies turned out to be wrong in some way or otherwise deficient.
All right, with that, we conclude our Q&A section. Thank you both. And we'll go into the closing remarks, but as I mentioned earlier, I'll posit some questions to both of you, and hopefully you both take notes now as I mention the questions, and you address these questions in your closings. So we have one question here. What is the most efficient source of electricity in 2026? That could be a quick response from both of you in your closing. Another question, hundreds of millions of people globally still have no access to electricity. Does Ethan favor policies limiting their options to carbon-free sources? Both of you could tackle that question and address it. And finally, a quick question asking about political figures in the space who inspire you in the policies that you aspire for, or that has helped you build your argument for this debate. So I hope you took some notes, and with that, Ethan, you have your final 5 minutes for your closing remarks. Please take it away.
Thank you, Hekmat, and thank you, David, for a really interesting and thoughtful conversation. I'll quickly take those questions. I believe solar and wind are the most efficient energy sources. That's not to say we shouldn't have nuclear and geothermal and hydro and others, but I do think those two can be predominant and lead to a reliable grid. Globally, I think that the US should be a world leader in helping a lot of developing countries do what they call a leapfrog, where they don't have to go through the coal and natural gas to get to the end state of clean energy. We can work with our allies across the world to set up trade deals to bring them these technologies now and help the rest of the world develop. To politicians and inspiring figures, I wouldn't say any one person inspired me. I like to do my own research and draw from a variety of sources. I will say a policy that I kind of liked is Pennsylvania recently, under Josh Shapiro, created a program that if a project does not get permitted in the time that the government said it would, they get their money back. So that's the type of permitting reform that I would love to see. And by the way, they also were able to rebuild I-95 in 12 days by doing a much more streamlined permitting process. So I love getting to work with scientists. That's my job. I get to help them communicate, help them see their research get translated to journalists and get translated to the general public. And when David talks about kind of uncertainties in research, that's kind of at the core of what I do and what I train people on. No single academic paper has a exact number that we can use to levy a tax based on an externality, and that's why my answer before was kind of a dream scenario. But as we build more academic research, we start to find, I don't love the word consensus, but we start to find agreement on what the world looks like and what the truth is. That's how science works, that's how it builds. And as scientists are challenging each other and criticizing each other, that's when we learn what the truth is. So a few years ago, a group of 278 scientists, economists, and other experts from 65 countries wrote a report for the IPCC. And the way this works, they looked at thousands, tens of thousands of academic papers all over the world to analyze the state of the climate. They looked at 43 decarbonization solutions across energy, buildings, transportation, industry, and agriculture. They reviewed thousands of papers, as I said. And of those 43 decarbonization solutions, 16 actually started out saving money as opposed to the status quo. This included wind, solar, nuclear, shifts to public transit, fuel-efficient vehicles, and more efficient buildings. Another 13 start out costing between $0 and $20 per ton of CO2 emissions reduced, including hydropower, geothermal, retrofitting buildings, protecting and restoring forests and natural ecosystems, and a variety of sustainable agriculture practices. Now, I didn't bring up the costs of a changing climate too much tonight because I do believe decarbonization wins on its own merits, but it is our changing climate that makes this go from economically worthwhile to economically urgent and imperative. In the 80s, there were $33 billion climate disasters in the United States. In the 2010s, there were 131, and from 2020 to 2025, there have been 138, already surpassing this last decade. David said that we are getting all this alarmism that the end of the world is coming. That's coming from headlines. That's not coming from scientists. Scientists have been very clear and very accurate as to how they've projected a changing climate. Since 2010, we've spent $1.9 trillion on just the worst of the worst disasters. And these are going up for multiple reasons. There's more assets for disasters to hit. There's increased vulnerability just based on where we've built and where we're building. But there is a measurable link between greenhouse gases and a changing climate that produces more frequent and severe billion-dollar disasters. It's a nuanced process to attribute them. It's very precise, but scientists are working on it. I get to work with them a lot, and that's critical for tonight's discussion. So 16 out of 43 save money, another 13 cost less than $20 per ton, and because of its impact on a changing climate, a 2022 study in Nature calculated the hidden cost of carbon to be $185 per additional ton emitted, dramatically higher than every single decarbonization solution they studied. Decarbonization avoids hidden health costs and hidden costs on our land. It creates more reliable systems and a more secure world, and it is cheaper on its own merits if we just take away all of the preferential treatment given to fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethan. David, you have 5 minutes for your closing.
Thank you. I've had a lovely time tonight. Thank you, Hekmat, for your excellent moderation. Ethan, this has been a lot of fun, and I hope you've had the same amount of fun as I have. The first thing I would like to say, I mean, I would definitely question the merits of some of the causal relationships that Ethan just established, but I want to focus in on something slightly different, which is that it's not just scientists who I do think have gotten things wrong. For example, in that 2024 retracted Nature study I mentioned in my opening remarks. But it's also the government who uses the governments globally who use these flawed estimates to impose mandates, to change the regulatory landscape and the energy grids that can work within the regulatory landscape. This gets to the first question I should address, which is, what about developing countries? And I think the answer is yes. Developing countries deserve the chance to reach the prosperity, to extend their lives, their life expectancies, and to live better and fuller lives because they have access to affordable, cheap, abundant, and reliable energy. I would not pull up the bridge after we've crossed it. I'm going to be so unfair to Ethan as to quote from him when he doesn't have a chance to respond. But I think this anecdote, which is about a ConocoPhillips project known as the Willow Project in Alaska, which affected many of the native people there. And he said, of course, Alaska natives are no stranger to climate-induced seamelt, permafrost thaw, and coastal erosion, but most have expressed that the economic opportunity of Willow is too lucrative to decline. And I think we in rich countries, or in the richest places or the richest positions in rich countries, are able to absorb more of the costs of pro-green regulation than the citizens of developing countries. And we have to recognize that takes away some of the sting of bad government interventions. We don't feel them as acutely. And as we're thinking about how to proceed, especially on the global stage, that is critical. I would like to close, however, by talking about something that we haven't touched on today, which is that decarbonization is undertaken by institutions, both in the government and the private sector. And as these efforts have persisted, they have been accompanied in both public and private sectors by the rise of bureaucracies and endless spools of stifling red tape. It has also been accompanied by the rise of activist-dominated transnational organizations who trade in what I would consider routinely debunked science and exert startling controls over the activities of governments and industries alike. It is, in Andrew Studiford's phrase, a transnational technocracy. And this transnational technocracy is working to control global markets into furthering aims that do not actually benefit the individuals or the economies or they don't fit the economies of these various countries. I don't believe that this is a coincidence. The amount of oversight and direction that the undertaking of radical decarbonization requires um, almost demands the formation of office buildings and NGOs chock full of hall monitors, paper pushers, compliance officers, lawyers, nitpickers, naysayers, and other risk adverse administrators. And of course, we must not forget the trial lawyers. Now, we must be careful as Americans to think about our nation's character, our habits, and our dispositions. This kind of regulatory apparat, whether it is found in the administrative buildings in Washington, D.C., or it's found in the offices of organizations that coordinate at the highest levels of industry and government, are not, I would posit, consistent with the freedom and the bold entrepreneurial spirit upon which American prosperity rests. In some sense, the question of how we approach these questions is it defines our character both in who we are, but also eventually in who we become. And once again, I thank Hekmat, Ethan, and Young Voices for the opportunity to speak with you all tonight.
Excellent. Thank you both for your closing remarks. This has been an incredibly insightful debate. Very substantive arguments made from both of you, spirited exchanges back and forth. So I really appreciate the quality of the discussion that we had today. If you enjoyed tonight's debate, for all of you watching, please subscribe to the channel, share the stream, and follow Young Voices for future events. We have a number of events lined up. Our next one is going to be in New York City towards the end of March on voter ID or about immigration in this country, in our country. And we have more lined up. We have a weed debate coming up in April and an AI debate in May. So please keep in touch with us and follow us to find more. And before we let you go, please, David and Ethan, as a concluding remark, just tell us a little bit about where we can read further of your publications, and tell us a little bit about how we can follow you.
Sure. So I'm the training program coordinator at Metcalf Institute at the University of Rhode Island, and I should say my views are not the views of my employer. You can find my written work. I started a exclusive monthly newsletter called The Pebble, which you can find at patreon.com/thesweatypenguin. It started in November, and it's been a great way to keep the Sweaty Penguin website alive and keep my thoughts out there as I am in a full-time job, so I'm not doing a podcast or writing quite as much, but I do write there, and I would appreciate people checking that out.
Thank you. David?
Well, first I would echo what Ethan said. You should, in fact, follow him. I read quite a lot of his work in the last little bit, and I can say even where I disagreed with it, it was always very informative and well thought out, detailed, full of evidence and all kinds of other interesting things. For me, you can find my work where it is gathered, which is at twitter.com, which will redirect you to x.com, where my handle is at David B. McGarry.
All right, folks. Well, once more, thank you very much for highly engaging debates and highly insightful at that. And for all of you watching online, thank you for watching. Thanks for attending yet another